Right. Okay, let's make a start. My name's Stephen Hodge. I'm the director of the Griffith Institute for Educational Research, and I'm coming to you from the southern fringes of Bianjin, Brisbane, on the unceded lands of the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all of our Indigenous colleagues and students. Today's Big Picture talk is led by Professor Julie McLeod. Professor McLeod is Professor of Curriculum, Equity and Social Change in the Faculty of Education at Melbourne. Her research is in the history and sociology of education, focusing on youth, gender, inequalities, curriculum and educational reform. Julie, of course, is a wonderful and generous colleague who long ago agreed to be part of our Big Picture Talk series. But she has a special kind of, I think, claim today in that she leads a steering group that is working on the Australian Education Research Decadal Plan. And so I see that the presentation draws on that process, which has been an incredibly interesting process and a fraught process. So I'm really looking forward to Julie's theorisation and walking us through that process and the much larger issues around it. So, Julie, I'll hand over to you. Please note that the meeting is being recorded.
Sure.
We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of question time at the end, all going well. I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thanks very much, Steve, for the opportunity and the invitation. I feel you've been very patient as we've coordinated calendars, and thanks, Maria, too, for your coordination of getting the seminar off the ground. As I begin, I also want to acknowledge the lands from which I'm coming to you today. I'm speaking and I live and work on the beautiful lands, the beautiful unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to Indigenous elders and colleagues and any Indigenous peoples who may be present today. In fact, we have learnt in that orientation and learning to listen, we have really benefited. The decadal plan, the work that Steve was referring to, has been fundamentally, we've been challenged by many of our First Nations colleagues in really constructive and enabling ways to make sure what it means to not just say, but to enact a First Nations first approach. As I proceed, I also should say I'm in not absolutely my office at the moment, and so I can't see anybody, so I'm speaking to my own slides. So if I look a little disoriented, that's why. But as soon as we finish, I'll stop sharing and then be able to have a more interactive engagement. Steve is under strict instructions to give me a 5-minute warning because I'm pretty confident I might get distracted, but I will do my level-headed best. All right, so here's a bit of an overview. Steve's invitation was and I think it's a great focus for a seminar series, some of the big questions to think big, and he said I could be a bit more speculative if I chose. So obviously I've been very consumed the last year or two on the decadal plan, and which on the one hand is asking some kind of big questions about the future of educational research and what matters, but also asking some very logistical, strategic, pragmatic, policy-focused questions about how do we get from here to wherever we want to be. And some of the questions that I touch on today are informed by the convergence of those concerns. And as most researchers know, sometimes you get clarity out of a certain confusion and collision of ideas. And I'm hoping that there'll be something like clarity towards the end. So I'm going to take a little bit on some of the questions that have come back to me as I restart this decadal plan. And in doing this, I want to acknowledge, in discussing the decadal plan, the invaluable leading work of my colleague, Professor Jill Blackmore from Deakin University, who has been driving this for some years. We're a bit of a dynamic duo, I think, when we're together, Steve. And
sure.
also colleagues at the Academy of Social Sciences who are providing huge support and drive for this as well. And I came to this through my work in ARE, where I was recently president. Now, I'm going to start on this older quotation from Latour in 2004. And I want to start here because when I remember very vividly when I first read this essay, and I was on a plane to AERA, and I was priming myself to write a discussant comment in a Foucault and Education SIG, so very far removed from what I'm doing today. Nevertheless, this essay kept me awake on the plane, and it has sort of fixated me and circled around quite a bit over the last few years. And it sort of surfaced for reasons I didn't completely understand, but it entered into my kind of thinking about the decadal plan when I was trying to think about what does it mean to think pragmatically about education research without losing sight of critique and a critical orientation, but more kind of pressing in another ways, what does it mean to do critical work today? And that question, that self-critical question Latour asked himself, what has become of the critical spirit? Has it run out of steam? And that in that he is critiquing, he is being sharp, scrutinizing his own bent to focus on deconstructing, on understanding contexts, but not necessarily focusing on what it is that you're deconstructing. Similarly, there's been was an essay in critical inquiry that asked questions about the future of theory in the humanities. And it's been a kind of ongoing echo in a lot of discussions about the scope and future of the humanities and the social sciences, and education is firmly based in those. I think the literary critic, Rita Felsky, summed it up very nicely, for me at least, when she said, we could say for many scholars in the humanities, take out and put social sciences or education, critique is not one good thing, but it is the only imaginable thing. To refuse critique is to sink into the mire of complacency, credulity, and conservatism. So been thinking about these criticisms of critique, if you like, and where that takes us. Do you just go into this spiral of critique on critique? Now, more recently, and many people in the room may have been reading into this area for some time, but I've been looking in some recent philosophy of education on trying to think about what critical research in education means, what it might involve in a new key. Now, Hans Schildermans writes that a particular understanding of critique in education narrows down the philosophical relation to reality to a process of demystification, defamiliarization, and deconstruction, leading to, he argues, an extensive inability to speak positively about education. He challenges us, I think, and what's what I want to return to at the end of this paper, is how this, he calls a move to post-criticality, others have called it affirmative critique, aims at bringing to our attention ways of speaking and thinking about what is good and valuable in education. What do we want to save? What do we want to plan for? Right? What kind of futures do we see for what is good in education? And does this entail us doing educational research in a new key? So that's the question that kind of circles around for me. Now, as I said, these have been on my mind as we develop this 10-year roadmap. Where do we want education to be over the next 10 years as a nationally? And how do we get there? What are priorities across sectors, across universities even, for educational research? What are the political, policy and pragmatic questions that we bring to bear on this endeavour? Is it indeed possible? And Steve mentioned this, how does one find common ground, which is what is needed if you are at a certain kind, to think about developing a 10-year plan for the field? What does it mean when our sector is characterised by massive diversity in all its breadth and richness, and we do not want to simplify that, but one where dissensus, not consensus, is valued and probably more common? Now, as we know, there are long traditions and patterns of critical research in education. We've all, many of us do it, and it's done extremely well. How do we navigate policy strategy making and maintain these critical positions and lenses? Now, I want you to sort of hold on to those questions as I go through some of the more logistical and kind of aspirational contexts for setting up a decadal plan for educational research. It is a very ugly word, I have to say, decadal plan. I would think of it as a 10-year roadmap. I'm going to explain a bit about what that is, background, how we came to develop it, the consultation process, and some of you may have been involved in that in one form or another, themes that emerged out of the consultation, which we're now addressing, current state and next steps. Now, so these are some of the immediate, pardon me, coffee, national contexts and concerns that motivated us. Australia has a long and rich tradition, long history, and an incredibly vibrant field of educational research. So it's not about the quality or the vibrancy or the breadth or the relevance, significance, or anything about educational research. It's about ensuring it gets heightened visibility, profile, more properly invested, planned for future research capability, that it is positioned as a reliable and trustworthy source of evidence for policymakers and decision makers. We also were keen, and this has been a really important part of the consultation process, to build greater cross-sector conversations and to go on that difficult project of seeing where is there this common ground. Can we identify research priorities which, if we join together, we may be able to leverage greater impact? So these were sort of three key challenges that we started off thinking about: the visibility and impact of education research in policy forums and public debate. And a huge thing for me and for others as well, as to be widening the view on and the range of research that is noticed and taken seriously. Ensuring the profile and future capability of the education research workforce. And as I'll talk a little about shortly, there are many challenges facing the education research workforce: early childhood through to schooling, vocational and further education, and this other one of building collaborations. Now, just a little bit of history very quickly. I'm going to try and not speak through these slides. AARE has joined with the Academy of Social Sciences in response to some of these challenges, and we convened a cross-sector roundtable in August 2024 in Melbourne, hosted by Deakin University. At that day, we had people from many different sectors and peak organisations, as well as researchers at different career stages and areas of specialisation. It was a long and busy day and rich day of conversation, at the end of which we identified priority areas for focus and agreed to develop a strategic this decadal plan. So what is a decadal plan, et cetera, et cetera. On the right, the priorities and future directions for education research was an initial communique coming out from that round table, which summarised some of the discussions and listed everybody who was present as kind of signing off on this is how we want to move forward. You can see a copy of the report on either the Academy of Social Sciences Australia website or the AARE website of this initial report. Again, it was at a very high level, but involved a series of very serious commitments that have been followed through. So beyond the sort of, if you like, very immediate pressures on education and those priorities identified, we are at a particularly challenging time, political time and sort of historical time for educational research and all research in the social sciences. Greater the shifting geopolitics, uncertainty, national concerns over self-reliance and defence, huge anxiety and lack of trust in expertise, and social polarisation, climate change, climate emergencies and sustainability, and the imperative to properly address First Nations priorities. So part of what we've been doing as we develop this plan is to making a strong kind of cut-through message about why we need to do this and why education matters. Now, if you are working in the education field all the time, which we are, you forget to see it. You forget to make the case, but sometimes it needs to be spelled out in the most fundamental ways to remind people outside the field about why it is a national good and is underpins so much of social prosperity and individual well-being. Now, if we look outside Australia, there's been a number of international agencies chiming in, or in fact crystallising a discussion that the nature of education is fundamentally changing, or rather has not changed sufficiently to meet the needs of a rapidly transformed social and environmental and planetary context. Many of you will be familiar with the UNESCO report from 2021, which calls for a new social contract for education. And we see some of this big picture thinking as also informing the imperative for this way of thinking about the future of education research. It needs to be sustained, valued, and invested in. So I want to emphasize here, we're not talking about education itself, like every aspect of education. We are talking about research, education research, and how that underpins education practices and is needs investing in to look ahead. Now, out of that round table back in August 2024, which I think is just the other day, but I think it's 2 years ago, nearly. Again, some fairly high-level priorities, but what was important was the agreement in the room. And what we're now doing now is trying to put a bit of a detail through the consultation processes and through the writing of the plan as to what that looks like in actionable priorities. So a world-class connected research capability. How do we build how do we support ongoing research workforce capability when we know many people within the universities are facing precarious employment, teaching-focused or education-focused roles? There's generational gaps. There's people concentrated in areas where it's hard to get research done. So we sort of are fully aware, not fully aware, we are making sure that those considerations are brought into when we start to imagine what we need to do to nourish and ensure that we have this ongoing research capability and that it is connected across universities and across sectors. Now, the consultation approach has been pretty extensive. Started in December last year at the AARE conference in Newcastle, and it was then open for written submissions, and we concurrently held online and in-person roundtables. And those roundtables had people from deans of education to experts in early childhood education. Steve organised a fabulous one with colleagues in the vocational and adult and community education sector. We've worked with senior public servant advisors and representatives from Aero attending some of the consultations, as well as organisations that do a lot of research that's related to education, but we may not always see them, organisations such as the Institute of Family Studies. So we have really worked hard to try and bring a mix of views into these consultations. These are some of the initial questions that we brought into the consultation, but of course, the best discussion happened when people went off script, as it happens with all research. But there were many. Sorry, I'm just catching up with my own presentation. There were lots of discussions about, that mix of what's the problem now, what's the diagnosis of the issues we're addressing, but then shifting to how do we address it? What are institutional sector and policy enablers? How can we start to think about immediate and longer term supports that might be needed to fulfill these ambitions? And then we're down the bottom at the moment, there's dot points now of, as we draft and finalise the report, how do we ensure that this type of document doesn't stay a kind of rhetorical device at best, a bit of expensive printing on a shelf that occasionally someone might get down and go, yeah, remember that? What was that about, right? So that may happen, and we certainly hope it doesn't, but we're mindful that the education sector, there's always a lot of strategic documents, a lot of policy advice. How do we keep this relevant and helpful for individual researchers, research teams, deans, associate deans research, those working in vocational education or early childhood? What might such a document or a plan do to help them advance and advocate for investment in research? Now, so this is a sort of a summary of some of the themes that emerged out of the consultation process in the first half of the year. And it's a way of fleshing out the initial priorities that we had in that August roundtable. It was very clear, and particularly the highlighted points, that we needed a sharper language, a sharper way of conceptualizing and describing these issues, that some of the language around equity, was no longer working in an effective way. Politically or conceptually, the point was made repeatedly about the importance of adopting a First Nations first principle, and that an ethical, inclusive education research system that is good for First Nations communities and researchers is a system that is good for all. And that's been some very powerful, and kind of it's really shifted some of the ways in which we have been framing the plan. There is a priority agenda on education and research workforce. So this is a focus on aligning a body of research that identifies as a whole range of issues. Now, there is a massive amount of research going on in Australia, really ARC funded and other programs of work that are looking at challenges facing the school education workforce, and so that is fantastic, and I think we need more and more of that. But we also continue to need research that looks at workforce issues across all sectors. And that includes the research workforce, right? And what sort of research, what are the questions we need to better understand, and how can what's the research we need to do to make a difference, from teacher churn to concerns about well-being. This was a really big theme that came up in the consultations, that we had not in the initial discussions given sufficient recognition to pressures and sort of on educators and teacher well-being. A large continued theme was this connected education research capability, and ensuring that continues and growing it. The other related one is how do we drive this structural and cultural change for more joined up approaches to research, including more reasonable access to the to data, both large-scale administrative data and other data. How can we more genuinely and authentically collaborate and share resources, and to sort of have greater impact? There's massive opportunities to collaborate on the relationship, obviously, between research and policy and research and practice. The funding infrastructure, are the current schemes, well, ARC is still not released, but what are the current schemes? Are they fit for the type of research needs that education has? Now, just very briefly, I want to acknowledge some of the gaps that were identified through the consultation. And by gaps, I mean gaps in the provocation document that went out, which was reviewing some of the challenges in education. So these have come up as important things that any plan that we develop must take account of. I've talked about the First Nations priorities, knowledge and decolonisation of curriculum. There was, how do we develop a statement of principles, the bigger warrant for education research, when we know that there are going to be many, many different views on that? In a sign of the rapidly changing world, back in August 24, we'd possibly heard of AI, but no one had absolutely anticipated at all the rapid transformation it is generating. So that needs to be more centrally addressed. These well-being and effective dimensions of teaching and learning, research methodologies, how they're understood beyond areas of centres of specialisation. What are the critical traditions? Many people wrote and said, and this is again what prompted my opening questions. Education research is, on the one hand, advocating for greater cut-through with education research, but then education research has strong critical traditions, and we do not want to lose sight of that. And there's been a lot of discussion through many forums on differences in evidence, whose evidence matters, what's rigorous, reliable, trustworthy evidence. Where do we, if we look across the sector, all the sectors, where are there capability gaps? Economics of education that's an area where I think it was agreed that there was needed to be we needed to grow that capability, and that mixed economy of public and private providers in the vocational education and early childhood education and care sectors. How will we speak to that? And then, of course, it's still not completely clear, but how will education research, how might it respond to this new commission, amalgamated commission? Now, sorry, oh yeah, so I'll just touch briefly on this. This was coming out of some of the synthesized the themes from some of the consultations. And again, it goes back to that principle statement about, and issues around equity and justice is for the plan itself to be much clearer and blunter, bolder indeed, on what it is, the problems, the various problems that education is actually trying to address, who benefits, who gets to define the research and how it's done. This came up in particular in relation to working with marginalised communities as well, and also with children and young people. Are they going to be recognised as part of the consultation process? And it was also, you know, how do we acknowledge, if you like, children's and young people's voices in any research agenda and in this plan? And obviously it's fundamental to a First Nations First approach. Now, what does it mean then if we write this document, and I'll give you a little bit more example of what it would look like shortly, is how do we know? Like, we're setting up this decadal plan, 10 years. I mean, you know, it's hard to imagine. All we know is that there'll be change, and it won't, in 10 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, everything is likely to, there'll be significant changes. We're envisaging that as the plan develops, and it's going to be launched later this year, we're looking at a launch in Parliament in Canberra in November, and then at ARE later, early December. Will we do it by sort of annual report cards from various sectors or groups that have been working on aspects of our priorities? How's it governed? What's the oversight of it? Does it just get printed and go out into the world? What exactly are the accountabilities? Right? Who's accountable for delivering, and what happens if we don't? Strategic benefits. Okay. How do we get some stability and coherence and long-term commitment from partners across the sector who have put their weight and their money, including your research institute, to supporting this plan? How do we balance that long view with practical, immediate priorities and actions? Where we're at the moment is that in going forward, it'll continue to be a partnership between the Academy and ARE with other partners on a steering committee to oversee the priorities activities. Now, where we're at, current drafting, we are developing in this, there'll be a next stage draft out in, I think it's August, really trying to finesse and develop that, the principles and the warrant for why now, not just any old time, but why now we need to think big and plan for educational research, the future of that, the ideas of the sort of new social contract for educational research, the 3 principles that we're drafting, and kind of helping to guide our work are First Nations first, recognition and valuing of diversity. Now, we all know diversity does a lot of work as an adjective or noun, but includes types of research and disciplinary diversity. How do we have, you know, we value forward thinking, socially innovative, but also responsible research that is deeply ethical. And that needs to be about research that is across discovery, strategic and applied research. I think one of the points we want to keep making is that on the one hand, we've been emphasising the need for educational research to have profile and be listened to by decision makers, that it's social good, it's essential. The benefits of educational research are communicated widely across the profession, within universities, the wider community, funding agencies, and policymakers and government. So we really want to communicate that. We also want to ensure that investment in discovery research remains seen as inextricable to those other benefits of research on that continuum. So we've been identifying goals, priorities, actions, timeframes. I'm sure many people have been through these sorts of things. And also, sorry about the typo, reporting, who are reporting to, and how will we know at the end of 5 years, 3 years, or 10 years that it has been worth to do this, and what will the benefits look like for individual researchers, for institutions, and for the sector. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to just return to the question of critique and debunking. So I've gone through a kind of, it's not exactly policy making, but it's a process and a plan that is strategically driven. It's working pragmatically. It's working in the space of compromise making. And it is directed to people who make decisions, policy making decisions. And it's trying to create change but not lose sight of some of the valuable critical traditions within educational research. So this is how I come back to these questions. Now, as I said, how we might envisage the future of educational research is, an ethical, a philosophical, a normative set of questions. It's also got practical and logistical and strategic dimensions. It necessarily engages policy making, policy construction, and critique. So what we've been grappling with here and wanting to be interested in conversations on is, how do we find ways to be critical? What do we mean by that? That can also build something else, not undermine the object of inquiry or take it apart or deconstruct it, or simply focus on the bad context that made it happen or the conditions of possibility. At the end of his 2004 essay, Latour asked, is it really asking too much from our collective intellectual life to devise at least once a century some new critical tools? Now, for me, that's been a very kind of potent provocation. And I think we need to keep asking ourselves that, particularly when we're doing something like thinking big about the purposes and possibilities and priorities for educational research. Are there new critical tools? Do we have new critical tools? What are these critical tools that we have to hand? We take apart and rebuild and try to grasp the past and present and to build an uncertain future. We are straddling now, feel like we're in the middle of, spaces of critique and strong traditions of educational research, reimagining what that might in a language and mode look like in a language and a mode that speaks beyond our specific domains. A philosopher of education, or a historian of education, writing in the Journal of Education Philosophy, the American one, argues that in contrast to the debunking style of critical histories of education, and she's advocating for post-critical histories, they make a compositionist. They bring together many things and a caring effort. They care about the object under inquiry. Whereas critical history of education, she argues, I'm not necessarily endorsing this, often shames those who find themselves manipulated and naive. They've made a mistake. They need to have the truth told to them through deconstruction. Post-critical history of education is rather linked to an epistemological and political concern to create relational worlds and responsibilities. So I think I just want to, I think it's possible that, these critiques are rather time-bound specifics in that they're very much arguing against both Foucault and Bourdieu, particularly in education, and the rise of those modes of interrogation over the last 3 to 4 decades. There are many longer traditions of critique in education, but they are this post-critical historical work, and post-criticality, I would argue, is very much taking to task a relatively, time-bound version of what critical theory is in education. We could, for example, as very much formed me, traditions of feminism in education is both a political project, it was both a taking apart and a rebuilding project. So trying to sort of return to or hold on to some of those elements where we bring together critique, care, a sense of what matters in education and how we might go about building that. Now, I'm going to just end, yes, that's my final slide. On this, I said something about the temporalities of education policy or forgetting. Now, many people write about, this is just a current one from GIER, about, that the importance of memory as a connective force, how it brings together the past, holds us into the present and allows us to imagine, and it's non-linear, it's all mixed up, a bit messy. But so I do think when we're doing this work, which is very future focused, we need to keep in mind the kind of memory of the past and memory of policy reform and policy problems that informs what we do. Now, Stephen Ball has written recently that sociology of education, from which I'm speaking largely, eschews forms of critique that might enable us to properly recognise that the things, values and events that make up our present experience have been constituted historically, discursively, practically. And there is a long or growing body of work acknowledging the ways in which educational research, in its focus so much on the future, tends to forget, if not erase, part of the past, with an emphasis on contemporary renewal all the time. My final point is that obviously imperative and essential critique, but also important to remember the longer history of critical stances and critical politics in education, not to shorten the history of criticality, and to remember the politics of deconstruction can also be productive, as in the case of feminism. And I'm going to end there and stop sharing if I can. Oops. There we go. I'm out.
Thanks so much, Julie. Join me in thanking Julie for that wonderful presentation. Julie, we have about a quarter of an hour for questions.
Yep.
Now I've got the chat panel open, and
yep.
we'll monitor that if people want to write down any questions or observations instead of speaking them out loud. But yep. Otherwise, please use the raise hand function and jump on in with your questions. Julie, while we wait for people to gather their thoughts, I wonder, could you touch on something that's, I think, been very gently touched on in the presentation, but that is about the need to strengthen the visibility of education research. So thinking about that slide about strengthening visibility, I'm kind of reading that and thinking, well, is there a visibility problem? And if there is, has it got worse or better over the time you've been an education researcher?
Yes, great question, that comparative one as well. And I think that the tempting thing is to say yes. I've just been at another forum discussing the profile and visibility of the social sciences more broadly. And that discussion was talking about the visibility of social science research with ministers and with the public service, where there is a more closed view now, less open to engaging with the academy. That's one way. So I think that has also affected education from comparing when I first entered. I think it is visible in some repeated ways. It's visible in terms of being held responsible for many woes. So that educationalization, it's visible like that. I think what has happened is that there's to my mind, a narrowing of what counts as good educational research. So, and I think that so many people feel that their research may not be visible, but in the public domain, there's certain types of research get a lot of profile and visibility. But how we ensure that the richness of that research is not only communicated, if you like, sideways and upwards to decision makers, but that its benefits are better understood in the even in the wider community, among the media, among the universities, and the sort of hierarchy of knowledges that exist in universities as well. So I do think there has been a shift in that.
Okay, thanks, Julie. I've got a whole bunch of questions, but I'm not going to take all the oxygen out of the discussion. Does anyone have a question for Julie or would like to add to some of the points that have been raised? Okay. Now, Barney Delgado has popped
oh, yeah. Hi, Barney.
Into the chat. You can see that, Julie, and would you like to respond, followed by Julie?
I wasn't current. Yeah, you get a sense of why these stakeholders see the current, ensure that it meets the current. Thanks, Barney. Can other people see the question? Governments and school systems are key current and potential future funders. Get a sense in the consultations, educational research. Yeah, that's good. And Barney was also on the steering committee for a while too. So thanks, Barney. Yes, we did. And it's a very clear message about it in the general sense that alignment with their priorities, it's not, you're not going to get anywhere unless we align with those priorities. And it is on, there were priorities on workforce and particularly on I think around retention. Obviously, these recurring priorities on both, I suppose, student learning and quality of teaching. Now, these are, on the one hand, no surprises, but they continue to be important priorities that come up. So, of course, you cannot ignore those. And the other one is how investment in education research can better support, workforce readiness and productivity. Yeah. So the workforce of teachers, but also the workforce readiness of students. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Jen, you've got your hand up. Thank you. Jen Orford.
Oh, hi,
thanks,
Jen.
Steve. Hi, Julie. Thanks, Stephen. And hi, everyone. Julie, you've blown my mind again. I love hearing you talk. Thank you so much. There was so much in that presentation. It really will sit with me for a long time. But I wanted to just come back to the words in your title, the politics, what is it? The politics of the pragmatic.
Yeah.
And, in moving towards the post-critical and away from pure critique,
yep.
While I think we need critique, we also need viable, positive solutions. But I'm just really interested in what that means for us as researchers, because, doing that kind of work requires very deep engagement empirically with schools, with communities, with teachers, with kids, which is, a very pragmatic set of conditions around research. So I'm really interested in how we do that in ways that are sustainable.
Yep. Great question again. I mean, I think that if you like, it's not quite, it's not slow research, but it involves a different way of thinking about funding timeframes, outputs, measurables, all the kind of standard language. We're all used to working, well, not all, but, you know, there's a classic 3-year cycle for a project. So I think part of the, when we're thinking about building research capability, it is about ensuring that there's different, if you like, tempos and registers for research and recognition of those partnership building. You know, on the one hand, universities, at least, are elevating and prioritising research impact. You know, collaboration, user engagement, all of, you know, very important. But somehow we would be hoping that the plan might provide some leverage, strategic leverage in a way. It is pragmatic in that sense, to make the case or show the benefit of that longer embedded, empirically driven set of questions, which is part of where some of that post-critical work is going, a kind of renewal of that empirical engagement. So I have no quick answers other than that I think it's front of mind.
Yeah.
Like we have in terms of, you know, often if we think of borrowing from, say, big STEM or quant social science, the solutions are often big programs of work, you know, get a centre of excellence, you know, big 5 to 7 years, and they're fantastic. You can do amazing things, but we also need to have research that is doing that careful work ground. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Great.
Yeah, great, Jen. Julie, I'm just going to read from Ruth Faliolo's comment. I don't think there's a question here, but I'll read this out because it's a very apt observation. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation today and thoughts on critical research in education. I agree with your comments on the importance of criticality that engages the past in our making sense of the present and working towards the future. Our individual and collective memories and intergenerational meanings as Pacific migrants living in Australian diaspora contexts provides better understandings for educators of learners and learning for Pacific people. So that's a great comment. And Ruth, feel free to jump in with a question if you'd like. I wonder, while people are thinking of other questions, I think, look, can you just confirm something? That looking across your presentation, you started with, you took us deeply into the nature of criticality and contemporary debates around what that means. Then you took us to the decadal plan. So I'm just wondering, would you be positioning the decadal plan as an example of that affirmative criticality that you kind of opened up at the very start?
Yeah.
Is it that?
Yeah, no, that is, that kind of was keeping me awake last night. So
sorry.
No, but I think, to be frank, it didn't start like that. I didn't have that language necessarily to understand it in that way. However, it is, and many of us work in these dual ways, like you're wanting to engage with certain processes and pragmatics of policy making and trying to, I don't know, make the university be a better place, while all the time this sort of noise of criticality is going on, right? And so it's managing that. And I do think planning for the future of educational research is actually being really challenging when you shift from that mode of, I understand the problem, right? I understand the lack, the risk, how it's failed, but then to try and refocus on how else it might be, not in some romantic utopian way, but how else we might collectively build something. I do see as an affirmative, it's a kind of caring for the object of education.
Yeah, good.
I don't think that'll go into politicians in that quiet language.
No, okay. All right. Now, I'm just looking at the comments and the fact that we just have a few more minutes. Perhaps the last question we'll take is in the chat John Clark has put in a question. How do we make research and innovation scalable? Can we build in the potential for systems improvement into our fine-grained, located and contextual research projects?
So I think I understand that, John. So that's how do we make that? Can we build in the potential for system? Well, I mean, I suppose one could, but I think, yeah, scalable research is the thing that, those, going back to Barney's question about what might departments and school systems want, is that they want research that is scalable and technical, and that researchers have a certain technical expertise to help solve a particular problem, not just, so at systems level, at technical, statistical level, economics, whatever, they want that expertise. So I do think that that's important, but it's not necessarily the way all research should go, because if you're wanting a diverse, rich, vibrant, cross-fertilized sector, you need to have different types and scales of research. And I think, if you're going from the ethnographic, there may be elements, say, from ethnographic work or complex case study work that can resonate or speak beyond that specific, but it's not always immediately scalable, right? And so but it depends how it's designed in the first place, because otherwise you will find, and that somehow or other a case study can be positioned to drive national policy reform. It may or may not, but it's unlikely, right? But so I think we need to, some projects will need to be are scalable. There's a lot of research now that is doing that, but I would not want to put that as a criteria to measure the quality and significance of all educational research.
Yeah, thanks very much, Julie. That's a great answer. I feel that we should make room for one last question, and that's from Tufam. I'm interested in your recommendation around First Nations first. Based on your findings, where do you see First Nations research sitting within that picture? And that will be our last question.
Okay, thanks. And where do we see First Nations research fitting in that picture? So we have First Nations experts on the steering committee, and we've been consulting widely with other groups. So we would seek their advice. However, I think the one thing I'd want to say is that First Nations research should be informing all dimensions of the report. It does not belong only under that rubric, that category of First Nations first. It is. I mean, it is an incredibly diverse field. There's not a single thing called Indigenous type of research. So I think that we would want to. A First Nations first principle does oblige you, makes you responsible for ensuring that you are listening to and taking heed of Indigenous research from First Nations people on specific topics, as well as informing broader research agendas.
Yeah, that's good. All right, folks, we might just wind up there. We're on the hour. Julie,
can I also, thanks, Paolo, for Michaelinas. It's a good ref. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been watching that. Yeah. So once again, thanks, Julie, for your wonderful presentation, for generously taking all these many questions. Have a great day, everyone. It's Friday. Bye.
Thank you.